Brown has been in the news for like the last week, man. It all started back when All the Smoke podcast really got this Kwame Brown stuff started, and Kwame himself has just taken it to a whole new level. And I'm gonna dive into like what started this stuff and how it's going so far, right? So for those who don't know, Kwame Brown is the former number one overall pick by the Washington Wizards in the year 2000 or 2001. Let me make sure so I'm not misquoting anything. But he was the number one overall pick in the 2001 NBA draft. So it's been exactly 20 years since Kwame Brown was taken number one overall in the NBA by the Washington Wizards, who was ran by Michael Jordan at the time. He was the team president, GM during that time of the Wizards, and he took Kwame Brown number one overall. Now, for those of you who don't know the significance of Kwame Brown going number one overall to Michael Jordan, it was the simple fact that Kwame Brown, he was a 17-year-old high schooler out of, 17-year-old high schooler out of Georgia via South Carolina, and he goes number one overall. In 2001, he was the first ever high school player to be picked number one overall. Like, he was the first one. He was before LeBron, before Dwight Howard. KG went in the top 5. Kobe Bryant wasn't even in the top 10 as far as high schoolers being drafted. He wasn't even drafted in the top 10. So Kwame Brown was the first number one overall pick as a high schooler. Before Moses Malone, like I said, not Kevin Garnett, not Kobe Bryant, actually Kwame Brown to the Washington Wizards. Now, that to me is just mind-blowing. And so that is the reason why Kwame has always been subjugated to, criticism and to all kinds of, bad stuff, because he was taken number one overall. And for his career, he averages 6 points and 5 rebounds. And now we know for a number one overall pick, that is what we consider a bust. So I give you all, I want to give you the context to build you up to why Kwame is so pissed, right? Why Kwame is, going off on these folks. Because he went number one overall. He didn't have the career people expected him to have. Not to say he had a disappointing career, but he didn't have the career people expected him as a number one overall pick to have. But he did last 13 years in the NBA, and he accumulated over $65 million. But okay, so got to give you all the background. So fast forward to 2021, 20 years since Kwame Brown was taken number one overall. You got to think, in those last 20 years, he's been talked about as the worst number one overall pick in the history of the game. Stephen A. Smith's career actually was created or elevated because of his historical, funny, super funny rants about Kwame Brown and about him being a bona fide scrub for years. Okay, so giving you that context. So now, fast forward to 2021. All the Smoke podcast, they had Jeannie Buss, the owner of the Los Angeles Lakers, on their podcast. All the Smoke podcast is ran by Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson. They invited Jeannie Buss on an episode about 2 weeks ago, and they were in there discussing about the Paul Gasol trade. In the Paul Gasol trade, he was traded for his brother, or the rights to his brother, Mark Gasol, who actually plays for the Lakers now. But back then, around 2008, he was traded to the Lakers for the rights to Mark Gasol and Kwame Brown. So Jeannie Buss is explaining the trade. She's like, yeah, we got Powell because we traded Mark Gasol and Kwame Brown in a 3-player trade. And Steven Jackson and Matt Barnes said, no, that was just a 2-player trade. It was Mark for Powell. That was it. That's all y'all did. And they excluded Kwame, like a shot at Kwame Brown, like a little jab, a little subtle jab, boom, little subtle jab, right? And so a week later, because they do the podcast like they do like release episode every week, Gilbert Arenas was on the podcast. So that's how it started. And that's what got Kwame fired up. Now, a week later, Gilbert Arenas was on the podcast. And Gilbert Arenas, of course, played for the Wizards while Kwame was there. He signed to the Wizards from Golden State on a big contract. And Kwame Brown was actually on the team. And during that exchange, there was another subtle jab by Steven Jackson, Matt Barnes, about Kwame. So, Kwame, who has been taking not just subtle, but been taking severe shots and severe criticism over the last 20 years after being drafted number one overall, the first high school basketball player that went number one overall after being drafted to Michael Jordan. Kwame Brown said, man, forget this. I'm tired of being talked about. I'm tired of people, throwing these little subtle jabs, doing these subliminals, doing all of this stuff. And I ain't never said nothing for 20 years. Kwame Brown been out of the spotlight since he left the NBA around 2013. He's like, man, forget this. And he goes off. He goes off. And what some people would consider, and they would always say this, they said he chose violence. He chose violence. He chose violence. And Kwame seems to hate that phrase because he's like, man, I didn't choose violence. They talked about me. All I'm doing is responding. And so for every action, there's a reaction. And when you do and or say something about somebody, you can't tell them how to respond. So with that being known and that being said, Kwame has responded like only Kwame can. But he is going all full steams ahead, no holds bar, specifically against Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson. That's who he was going after. Then Charlamagne the God. Insert Charlamagne. And I like Charlamagne. I like all of these guys. I like Matt. I like Stack. I like Charlamagne. Charlamagne inserted himself. He inserted himself. He didn't have to, but he inserted himself by giving a comment about Kwame Brown's father and his brother. Allegedly, now I didn't look this up, but this is what Charlamagne said on his radio show. He said Kwame's father and brother murdered women. He said Kwame Brown, because Kwame Brown's family is from the same city, Moncks Corner, South Carolina, as Charlamagne. So there's really close ties. I'm sure in that little small town in South Carolina, Moncks Corner, they probably all know each other. So allegedly, Kwame Brown's dad, and I don't know, once again, I haven't fact-checked it, but Charlamagne went on radio and said Kwame Brown's daddy killed the woman, Kwame Brown's brother killed the woman, and something else about Kwame Brown's sister. So that's how Charlamagne got inserted in all of this. And Kwame was pissed. Once again, every action has a reaction. So Kwame, to defend his family and to defend himself and his family, he talked about an alleged rape case that Charlamagne had, or an alleged, like Charlamagne allegedly would seduce women and drug them out on some like Bill Cosby stuff, apparently, is what Kwame was saying. Once again, I have not fact-checked any of this. These are just the statements that these people have put out on the internet, right? It was like, Charlamagne, you speaking on me, and you was out here, being an alleged pedophile, an alleged rapist, or whatever. So I'm like, dang. So that's when it started getting rough. And Kwame brought out, so when Charlamagne does this, he talks about Kwame's brother being an alleged killer, his father being an alleged killer, and his sister. I don't know if he said she was a killer or something. He said something about his sister as well. Kwame responded, and then Charlamagne actually apologized. He went on the Breakfast Club and issued an apology simply because what he knew he did was wrong. He said Kwame's dad was a killer, his brother was a killer. So watch out for Kwame because he got killer in him. It runs in his family. And I guess being a killer is genetic, right? So he alleged, just went on to, he didn't so much as said, like, watch out for Kwame because, Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson better quit playing with him because his daddy done killed somebody, his brother done killed somebody, his sister done did some stuff. Like, you better watch out for him. So Kwame wasn't feeling that and talked food to Charlamagne and talked about, his alleged rape cases and all kinds of crazy stuff. And Charlamagne went on the radio and apologized. He went and said, like, people from his hometown was telling him what he did was wrong and all of this stuff. And so he issued an apology. Well, Kwame Brown responded and was like, that apology's BS. I'm not hearing what you got to say about that apology. We know that was your corporate sponsors and your corporate people telling you to come apologize so you can keep it. You can save it. And all them other folks that are around you that allowed you to do what you've been doing over the past 10 years, the Breakfast Club's been on 10 years, to make women cry and to tuck all of this crazy stuff. And basically, he says the Breakfast Club denigrates Black people. He said the Breakfast Club is not good for the Black community. Now, that is debatable, but this is the words of Kwame Brown. Another thing that Kwame said, that really pissed him off because Matt Barnes responded to him in one of them earlier videos. Because Kwame's been making at least 1 or 2 videos a day since this, and his following has exploded, right? He was getting like, on his YouTube channel, he was getting like 5, 6, maybe 7,000 views on videos before all of this nonsense. Now he's getting a couple 100,000 a video. Now he's got a couple 100,000 subscribers. Now he's got a couple 100,000 Instagram followers. His Instagram wasn't even verified before all of this craziness started. It might still not be verified yet, but it will be soon. So Kwame is making his rounds and making some noise. But one thing I will say about, and one thing Kwame has done, and he has brought certain things to the table, right? Because Kwame doesn't work for iHeartRadio, because he doesn't work for Showtime, because he doesn't do things with white corporations, at least not as of yet. He probably will soon, but if he stands on what he continues to stand on what he's been saying, he won't. Because he doesn't take orders from anybody, he's being raw, authentic, and uncut. We know that, well, I like All the Smoke, and All the Smoke is pretty raw and authentic and uncut, but you can tell that they're owned by Showtime, which is white people. So you can tell they're owned by white people because there's certain things they do, it seems like, to appeal every demographic. The Breakfast Club is pretty raw, authentic, and uncut, but they're owned by iHeartMedia. So you can tell that there's certain things that they do because they're owned by white people, right? Like, yeah, they're pretty authentic, but there's certain things that they do and certain things that they say and certain apologies that they issue is what Kwame was getting at, because they're owned by white people. And so what Kwame is saying is there is attack on black masculinity and there's attack on black people. And that's something like right here on this platform we've talked about. We've talked about the attack on black masculinity. That's why the movie Buck Breaking, which is a great documentary, by the way, produced by Tariq Nasheed, dives into the attack on black people and black masculinity. It's all throughout the mainstream media. And so Kwame is saying that these guys are minions for white media to have an attack on black people, an attack on black men specifically. Now, I'm not going to agree with Kwame 100% on some of these individual characters, but what he's saying is not wrong. He is saying absolutely what he's saying is the absolute truth. Now, a lot of it gets misconstrued and kind of like pushed to the side because he uses a lot of profanity, right? So you look at it as like comedy, at least I do. But but some people are really grasping onto the bigger picture. What Kwame is saying is absolutely right. There is an attack on masculinity in the mainstream media. There is an attack on the black man in the mainstream media. Whatever you do, whatever you say can be used and will be used against you as a black man. And so what Kwame is saying is that these guys, he's talking about these individuals, Charlamagne the God, Matt Barnes, and Stephen Jackson, have been caught up in the mainstream media making this money from these white people, and they're forgetting who they are. They're talking about him, Kwame, and he feels like they shouldn't be talking about him. He's a black man just like they are. He feels like they have and continue to take money out of his pocket and food away from his family. And so that is what has made him to snap like this. He's also talked about Stephen A. Smith and Skip Bayless doing the exact same thing. When you and we also heard Russell Westbrook talk about this a little bit, specifically towards Stephen A. Smith, talking about when you give these people, give these athletes, and you talk about them and you give them these labels and you say they're this, this, and that, which they are, may or may not be, and call them a bust and do all kinds of stuff. That is the perception that people, regular people, garner. That's how you see these people. You see them as like unsuccessful because they weren't good at basketball. You see them as like just trash human beings because they weren't good at a sport, because their stats didn't line up. And he's saying the people in the media, Stephen A., Charlamagne, Matt Barnes, Stack, Jamel Hill, Skip Bayless, they're denigrating and they're hurting the black community by giving all of this criticism towards people like himself. Now, like I said, there is a ton of truth in that. In a lot of ways, he is not wrong. In a lot of ways, he is not wrong. But what I will say, Kwame, is if you play a sport and you get paid millions of dollars to play said sport, then you're open to criticism. If you're going to collect a check for millions and millions of dollars, you should be open to some criticism on your game. Now, I'm not going to talk about you as a person. I don't know you as a person, but I can criticize and critique your game on the court. But when you go about name calling and calling people out of their name calling and saying personal stuff, that's when I agree with Kwame. Charlamagne going on there talking about all of Kwame's families as killers, so killer must be hereditary or genetic. No, dog, you don't cross the line. And your apology doesn't seem sincere because you're reading it off and it comes a day late and $1 short. So that is the background of Kwame Brown and his situation with his attack and fight against Matt Barnes, Stack, Charlamagne, Stephen A., Jamel Hill, Skip Bayless, and his love for guys like Jaylen Rose. simply stems from Jaylen Rose defending athletes and defending them even when they're considered a bust. Because Jaylen Rose, he says, man, if the media, described me like the way they describe my career, I'd be a bust or a failure at life. When I've done way better things that don't include a basketball, way better things in my life I've accomplished outside of an NBA court, outside of a court for the University of Michigan, outside of a basketball court. And that's why Kwame gave big ups to Jaylen Rose, because Jaylen Rose gets it. Even though the clips that he was referring to are like years and years old, but he ain't ever spoke about it. So this last week was his time to speak on the stuff, and a lot of things he said is actually pretty accurate. Leave your thoughts and comments down below on the Kwame Brown situation. Kwame Brown versus Stack 5 versus Matt Barnes versus Stephen A versus Skip Bayless, Jamel Hill, Charlamagne the Guy, all of that. And he seems to have a real issue. I'm going to say this last point. I'm going to get out of here. Kwame seems to have a really, really, really big issue with Matt Barnes. And here's why. Here's why he has a bigger issue with Matt Barnes. And he has a problem. Like, he's still going after Stack too, but it's mainly Matt Barnes. And here's the thing with Matt Barnes. So, once again, Matt Barnes actually responded. He responded to Kwame Brown. He responded to Kwame Brown. One of the videos. Kwame had made a ton of videos by this point. And Matt Barnes responded. He said, hey, man, get my name out your mouth. So he referenced his male genitalia. Kwame wasn't feeling that. He's like, hey, man, get my name out your mouth. And Kwame was not feeling Matt's speed on that. And Kwame's probably made 10 videos since, talking about how Matt Barnes is all kinds of, he said, if I woke up and chose violence, Matt Barnes woke up and chose punk, because he just told me to put his genitals in my mouth. And he goes in and in on that. If you want to see Kwame Brown's videos, type in Kwame Brown, A Bust Life, B-U-S-T, A Bust Life on YouTube, and you'll find all his stuff. And he's on there, like I said, several times a day. He has a huge following now. We're talking about 35,000 people at a time watching his videos when he goes live. And that's only fueling him. It's only fueling him to do more and more, because now he has an audience. Now he has a platform. Now he has people actually tuned in, wanting to and hanging on every word that he says. Because a lot of people agree that these guys, whether it's true or not, but a lot of people agree that these guys get these paychecks from these white corporations, whether it's Showtime, iHeartMedia, Fox Sports or whatever, and go on there and bash black men. Now, I don't think that's all the way true, but that's how Kwame feels. And that is why he has so many people hanging on his every lasting word he puts out now, because they feel it's all the same. So it's interesting. The Kwame Brown, Matt Barnes thing is interesting. Matt Barnes has invited him to all the smoke. He's also invited him to a boxing ring. Like, so who knows what's going to happen? Steven Jackson, Kwame Brown released some DMs from Steven Jackson that Steven Jackson basically was like, yo, leave me alone because I got some people that might do something to you. And Kwame wasn't feeling that neither. So it's really a big mess. And I'll continue to give you guys updates on it because it's interesting. But at the same time, we need to take something away from this. We need to be able to build together, not tear each other down with a bunch of profanity and a bunch of, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I get it. Like, every action has a reaction. These guys spoke about Kwame and spoke about him multiple times. And Kwame finally decided to address it. You can say snap, you can say he chose violence, whatever you want to call it. He addressed it. And this was his way of addressing it. And now he has an audience. So now he's going to continue to address it. He's going to continue to put out the information he feels like is real and not, fabricated or paid for. This is the way he feels. And I can't knock him for that because a lot of things he's saying is actually true. Once again, I'm Jeff Lightsy Jr. at the Black Boss channel and the Victory Formation Sports Show. Be sure to hit the thumbs up button, like, share, subscribe. Follow us on Instagram at VF Sports Show. We also go live every weekday morning at 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern on the Black Boss channel.